Coming up on this episode of Crime Family, Jeffrey Deskovic, a 16-year-old from New York who was wrongfully convicted for the murder and rape of a fellow classmate. After a shoddy and corrupt police investigation, Jeffrey was charged and eventually convicted. 15-year-old Angela Correa went out after school to take some photos for a photography assignment. So after she left home and she headed out and she didn't return that evening, her family was extremely worried and she was considered a missing person soon thereafter.
We're talking to Jeff and they're like, pretend it was you, what would you have done, and tell us from your point of view. And so when he was talking like first person. He was like, I walked down the path, like I saw her. And so they took this as like, look, he's telling the story, when it actually, that's what they told him to do.
Seminal fluid that was found on Angela's body that was sent for forensic testing and compared to Jeff's blood sample that he provided, and it was not a match. So looking at that alone should have exonerated him. Hi everyone, welcome to season 2 of Crime Family. So we're so excited to be back, and we've been working very hard during this hiatus to research intriguing and interesting cases for you guys, and we've even booked some very special guests to come on and chat with us as well. In fact, our first 2 guests are going to be coming on to chat with us in this special 3-part premiere episode. So we're very excited about this. And so in part 1 here, we're going to be telling you the story of Jeffrey Deskovic, wrongfully convicted for the murder of his classmate. He was wrongfully convicted of the murder and spent the next 15 years incarcerated for a crime that he did not commit. So in part 1, we're going to be telling you that story, and along with what happened in the case, as well as all the police misconduct that led to his very unfortunate conviction. Then in part 2, we are very excited because we have Jeffrey Deskovic himself here, and we are going to be chatting with him about his case, about his time in prison, and about the foundation that he was able to create after his release from prison, and all the great work he's doing now. So we're very excited about that. And then in part 3, we're going to wrap it all up with an interview with documentary filmmaker Gia Wirtz, who actually made a short documentary film about Jeffrey's case. So we're going to be talking with her about what it was like working on this documentary about Jeff's story, and we're also going to be chatting with her about her connection to another case that we actually covered last season. So it's going to be a very exciting 3-part premiere episode for you guys. We can't wait to get started. So without further ado, let's get into it. How do you guys like being back?
Happy to be back. Season 2, kicking it up a notch.
I'm excited to be back for season 2, and I'm excited to see how this season goes and what we have in store for you guys.
Yeah, so, we're Katie said we're kicking it up a notch. We have some guests planned. After the success of season 1, we're hoping that season 2 is even bigger and better. So with that being said, let's get started into our very first case of the season. Like I said in the intro, it is about Jeffrey Deskovic, and this is a very frustrating case and lots of injustice in this case, as you could probably tell from what I said in the intro. So there is a lot of information and things to note about this case, so I'm not going to go into every little detail because, like I said, we will be interviewing Jeffrey, and he'll probably have lots more insight and lots of other information that he can provide in that. So I'm going to kind of give you an overview of what happened in the case, as well as some of the major pieces of the investigation that were shoddy and stuff like that. So it's going to be comprehensive, but not the full rundown of every detail that we'll probably get from Jeff. So the story all begins on November 15th of 1989 in Peekskill, New York. 15-year-old Angela Correa went out after school to take some photos for a photography assignment. So her last stop before she headed out was at her own home. She went home after school to change into some different clothes and to pick up her camera for the photo shoot. So after she left home and she headed out and she didn't return that evening, her family was extremely worried and she was considered a missing person soon thereafter. So the last known sighting of Angela was from approximately 3:30 p.m. that afternoon, when an eyewitness claims that he saw her as he was walking through Hillcrest Park. He said that he heard voices which sounded like people were arguing but could not hear what was being said exactly. Nobody was certain who this other person was who was with her, or if this other person was the one responsible for her disappearance. All they know is that, according to this person, she was with someone else at the park around 3:30 p.m. So, however, the missing person investigation quickly turned into a murder investigation when Angela's body was found only 2 days later on November 17th. During the initial investigation, the police learned that she had been beaten, raped, and strangled. So the police cordoned off the area where her body was found, which was a wooded area of Hillcrest Park, and her body was covered with leaves. And there was actually 3 different parts of the park that were considered crime scenes. So there was various clothing items belonging to Angela that were found near her body, as well as a few pieces of white paper that was part of a handwritten note. And the note was actually written by Angela to a man named Freddie, and the date on the note was dated the 15th, so the same day as her disappearance. So of course, finding out who this Freddie person was would probably be a good place to start the investigation. Could this have been the person that was arguing with Angela around 3:30 p.m. on the 15th? So autopsy results were able to conclude that her likely time of death was between 3:30 and 4:30 p.m. on the same day that she disappeared. And this was right around the time that, of course, she was seen with someone in the park by the eyewitness. So other findings from the autopsy included the cause of death, which was determined to be a fractured skull, internal hemorrhage, and asphyxiation due to strangulation with a ligature. There was evidence to suggest that she had been sexually assaulted, and evidence that she had been actually dragged face down over a dirt surface. During the police investigation, it became very clear that the police had a specific suspect in mind, and like in a couple of other cases that we've covered and other wrongfully convicted cases, the police really started to have tunnel vision and became hell-bent on pinning the murder on one specific person. And in this case, that person was Jeffrey Deskovic. So he was a 16-year-old classmate of Angela's who had been allegedly absent from the school around the time that Angela was murdered. But other than Jeffrey's alleged absence, there wasn't much evidence leading the police to Jeff really at all. The police noted that he seemed very upset and hysterical over the news of Angela's death, which they did find odd, but that's hardly a smoking gun. Plus, police claim that he had matched a psychological profile of the supposed killer, but don't really know how they determined this psychological profile or what specific things matched Jeff. We might never know that, but they said that he matched this psychological profile that they came up with, and they said that he was absent from the school around that time, so therefore he had to be suspicious. And I don't know, but I guess they thought that his behavior was odd, like he was very devastated about hearing the news, and they kind of saw that as a sign of guilt or a sign of remorse. So they kind of used that as like a reason as to why they were focusing on him initially.
Did they just pick him out of the blue? Did she have a boyfriend or anything like that at the time that she went missing? Or is it just they just picked Jeffrey?
Well, I don't really know. I mean, I'm going to get into it a little bit, but they did question... they questioned a bunch of students, and they did question Freddie, who was the one that she had written the letter that they found near her body. But I don't know the specifics of what was it about Jeff. Like, maybe it was based on what other kids had said when they interviewed the other kids at the school, because he was kind of an outsider. He didn't have a huge social circle. Maybe he was a little bit odd or, different than the rest. So maybe they just kind of... But maybe the police were asking leading questions as well. Maybe they were asking questions about Jeff in a weird, kind of suspicious way, kind of leading them down to say these things about Jeff to kind of bolster their own theory.
Sorry, I don't know if you said this, but was Freddie her boyfriend, or was he just a friend?
I don't know.
I think it was just a guy that she had a crush on.
Oh, okay.
And watching like another documentary, I think it was Investigation Discovery, it said that when Angela was like a new student, he was the one that kind of showed her around the school, and he was really nice to her and stuff, so she knew him from that, sort of. But they didn't really have a relationship, though. Just friends.
I'm just trying to wrap my head around why they just picked Jeff maybe because he was an outsider, but I just don't... If he was just his classmate, and he didn't really have any connection to her. I just find it odd that they would just pinpoint him.
Well,
Like,
also,
I'm sure you'll get into that, but
I know, like, they did question a bunch of other students, but apparently a lot of them had support from their parents. I remember in that other documentary, they were questioning one guy, and his dad was outside the door, furious, like yelling, like, "Let me in! You can't talk to him." So they had to stop and let like these other kids go because of things like that. Where Jeff didn't have somebody like on the outside fighting for him like that. So they were able to like take him and talk to him without interruption or without, a lawyer. So he was kind of an easy target.
Okay, that makes sense, yeah.
Yeah, like maybe he was one of the only ones who wouldn't have their parents intervene and like not allow them to speak to the police or whatever, right? The others had parents that were sticking up for them or kind of protecting them from that, whereas Jeff didn't. So they kind of were like, well, this guy's making it easy for us, so we're going to just...
Yeah, and you'll probably get into this, but like Jeff was super willing to help because he wanted to be a cop and stuff. So he was like, yes, yeah. I really want to be involved.
Yeah, yeah.
So he didn't fight them at all. Like he was like, yeah, I really want to do this. So that didn't probably help him either.
I mean, he was 16, sorry. He didn't know that he was being looked at as a suspect. He thought they were just questioning him because he was a student. So like I could understand why he was so forthcoming with some information and stuff like that. But like any 16-year-old who just trying
to... But also, like, when you're 16 and stuff, you're not thinking, oh, they're trying to pin this on me. Like, you're thinking, oh, I'm innocent. I have nothing to do with this. They can't pin it on me. So, like, he didn't think that, offering up his help or assistance would be bad for him. He thought, like, I have nothing to hide. So, like, what's the harm?
Yeah, and he probably was completely unaware that they were, like, manipulating him the entire time when they thought that, they were being really friendly and nice to him because he was helpful. Yeah.
Yeah. So it just starts off crazy and it gets worse. A lot of this information is coming from actually a report that was done at the request of Janet DeFiore, which was the Westchester County DA at the time of Jeff's exoneration. So it was like a report kind of telling the story of the case and how the police investigation was botched and unjust. So that's where a lot of this information is coming from. But yes, so initially he was kind of looked at due to his reaction to the murder, like his hysterical reaction and the fact that he was allegedly absent, and he matched the psychological profile, like I said, but who knows like how they came up with this. So the DNA evidence that was found at the scene did not match Jeff's either. So it seems that the police had very little to go on except for circumstantial evidence or subjective observations of Jeff's reaction to the murder. So they're just kind of in their own minds, they're like, oh, this is kind of odd behavior, so that must make somebody guilty, versus, it's kind of a weird way to kind of come to that conclusion. But Freddie Claxton, who was one of Angela's classmates, and I guess Katie, like you said, was someone that Angela had a crush on. So he was assumed to be the Freddie that Angela had written that letter to that they found. But Freddie had an alibi for the time frame of the murder, so was pretty quickly ruled out. And in fact, Jeff had an alibi as well. He says that he was playing wiffle ball with a friend at the time of the murder, but for some reason, this alibi wasn't satisfactory to the police, even though Freddie's was. But I guess with the police, they only were going to hear what they wanted to hear, and his alibi didn't really fit in with their theory that they were going to go with, so they kind of just ignored it. So in order for the police to craft a case against Jeff, they began a months-long process of grooming and befriending him, kind of like you had mentioned a little bit earlier. This is kind of to trick him into believing that he was helping them with the investigation. So, as you said as well, like, important to note that at this age, Jeff had aspirations to be a police officer himself in the future. So obviously the opportunity to help investigators with solving this crime that happened to his classmate in his school, in his hometown, was probably really exciting for him. He thought, this is like my first chance to get, do police work. But it was all a part of the police's bigger plan. They had to kind of gain his trust enough in order to be able to corner him into a position where he would feel like he would have to come clean, quote unquote. The police misconduct in this case is so blatant and infuriating. Every step of the way involved lies, manipulation tactics, and basically just the blatant setup of a teenage boy who had no idea what the true intentions of the police really were. Jeff was being very cooperative with the investigation, like we kind of mentioned, probably so cooperative that it worked against him in many ways. He did provide the police with a blood sample in early January, and basically my understanding of how that went down was the police just said to Jeff that they needed him to provide a blood sample just to completely rule him out. Again, another manipulation tactic. Feel like, oh, we're not like suspecting it's you. We just need you to be fully cleared. We just need to get the blood sample out of the way just to kind of show a sign of trust on your end. So Jeff, obviously, because he had nothing to hide and didn't really know what was really going on, he provided the blood sample. So Thomas McIntyre and David Levine were two of the lead detectives on this case, and they were responsible for a lot of these tactics that were being used against Jeff. And so Jeff provided the blood sample to the police on January 10th of 1990. And something else that's very interesting and frustrating is during the various meetings and interrogations that the police were having with Jeff throughout these couple of months, there were tape recorders that were available that were not being used. The recorder was turned off and on multiple times throughout their many meetings. And there was one actual meeting, I guess, or interrogation that they had with Jeff that was actually over 4 hours long, but only 35 minutes of that session was actually recorded. So what was happening in these sessions where they didn't want it to be recorded? Like, obviously we'll never know. And there's another session on January 25th that Jeff had with police that was actually not recorded at all.
Sounds familiar.
Yeah, it reminds me of the Adnan case, right? Like with all those, all that tape recording and the craziness with that. So obviously the police are having something to hide. And I did read in that report too, there was tape recorders that were always readily available. There was nothing wrong with them. They should have been turned on. Like the acoustics in the room were like perfectly fine. So it wasn't like you couldn't use the excuse of like, oh, well, it wouldn't have picked up well on the recorder or whatever, like that they tried to use. The police had said that one excuse they gave for why it wasn't recorded was that the police left to go get coffee to turn it off and then forgot to turn it back on when they came into the room. Which, even if that's true, it's like horrible. Like, horrible to forget something like a major detail like that. And then
why not just leave it on the whole time? Like maybe he would have been like said something to himself while he was in there or something. Like you want to get that kind of stuff, you'd think. But
yeah, exactly. Those are the moments you'd probably want to record the most, when he's alone and doesn't necessarily know if he's being recorded or whatever, right?
Yeah, that's why they have like, now they even have like videos of everybody, even when they're alone. They don't shut the videos off. Like, you know what I mean? Like, so you can like constantly see what's happening.
Yeah. Well, and then there was another moment during all of this where the police officers tried to say that at first he was recording it like in his pocket, so it wasn't like visible to Jeff, and then he like pulled it out and put it on the table, and then he said it visibly made Jeff upset and uncomfortable, so then they turned it off just to show like a sign of they didn't want to make him uncomfortable, like they didn't want to stop what he might say, or so that was another reason that they gave, according to that report. But all sounds like BS.
Yeah, like I was gonna say, like most of the time when you see like interviews with people with suspects, they do have tape recorders 99% of the time just sitting there on the thing. And plus, going back to like the excuse of not having the right sound, interrogation rooms are made to be, I think, soundproof, so you can take out the background noise, so it's like easier for you to record stuff like that. That's why they have them in those little rooms like that. For that,
I mean, I don't know if I don't know if it
but
was in an official interrogation room though. Like if they weren't interrogating him, like obviously that might have made him feel nervous. If it was just like I don't know where else they would meet, but if it was somewhere else that wasn't like official interrogation room, but still, basically the report said that everything, all of the like situation was right for like the recording. Like there was nothing that would have hindered the quality of the recording. So really, there's no reason why it wouldn't have been.
So unfortunate that a lot of those things don't get recorded. Like it happens a lot more than we think it does in like most cases. And a lot of those recordings aren't usable in court per se because they're not reliable or whatever.
Well,
either.
Well, I mean, recordings are reliable. Like if it's a recording, it's a recording. But like, I think, like when there's a session that's over 4.5 hours long and you only record 35 minutes, like that's like almost 4 hours. That's just not even recorded. So who knows what's being said?
And the fact that these people are just letting that slide, not questioning the police of why they didn't record, like, you know what I mean? Like stuff that wasn't investigated properly on the police side, because like, why would you only record 35 minutes? Like somebody would have to be like, well, you should have recorded the whole thing. Like their, I don't know, chief of staff or whatever. You know what I mean? Like you think somebody like that would.
Which just kind of seems that like
more,
somebody they obviously have something they want to hide.
Just seems shoddy and shitty. So
I think now they're like our laws, or they're more strict about like you have to record everything. I think in some places there are anyway.
Yeah, which is obviously a good thing because maybe things like this won't happen in those laws. I mean, they probably still like there's probably ways to get around the laws and like all that stuff. So the police know how to like, you know, I feel like they know how to get their way around certain situations. But yeah, so Back to the DNA findings and Angela's body. So there was some seminal fluid that was found on Angela's body that was sent for forensic testing and compared to Jeff's blood sample that he provided, and it was not a match. So looking at that alone should have exonerated him and obviously not made him guilty in any way, because you can't really refute DNA evidence at all. So there was no scientific evidence that linked Jeff to the crime, no eyewitnesses or other leads that led the police to Jeff at all. In fact, all of those things did the opposite. So I don't really know, like I know I mentioned there was that eyewitness that said that they saw somebody with Angela in the park around the time she was murdered, potentially arguing with someone, but nobody ever said that this person matched the description of Jeff or anything like that. So no eyewitness was able to like definitively say for sure. And then if you just look at the DNA evidence, it wasn't matched for Jeff at all. And this was like back in 1989 or early 1990, so maybe like DNA wasn't what it is now, and it wasn't as like, you know, the end all be all. It might not have been trusted as much, so you can't really take it with the same, I mean, it's still DNA evidence, you can't refute DNA evidence, but I'm just trying to think like maybe it wasn't as well respected back then as maybe it is now, because like now it's pretty much like end of story. Like if it doesn't match, it doesn't match, right? There's also a million excuses people can give for, you know,
Yeah. Well, I mean,
if they're trying to push a narrative, they can.
Yeah, they used to be able to just do like blood testing. If it's a blood type match, then it was like, oh, maybe it was him. So it wasn't like it was inconclusive. It was actually not a match at all. So I mean, I think it would still hold more than it actually did to them, right? Like, and also you probably get into this too, but I mean, it was enough for them to have to, you know, manipulate what happened. You know? Yeah,
like clearly they knew that they didn't have what they needed just up front to like.
Yeah, exactly.
So like they needed to find a way to like make it fit their narrative, which is just crazy to me. So for unexplainable reasons, the police seemed uninterested in actually finding the real killer and just seemed to ignore all the DNA evidence that should have ruled Jeff out immediately. Instead, the police asked Jeff to conduct a polygraph test on January 25th, which he did agree to, and keep in mind he didn't have any lawyer or family members present at this time. And again, he's probably thinking like, well, you know, I'm not lying, I have nothing to hide, I'm not involved, so like what's the harm of providing this polygraph test? If like they need me to do it and it's gonna like completely rule me out, then like why not do it? But as we know, I feel like we've talked about this before, never do a polygraph. It never ends well for anyone for any reason. But even if like even if you don't do it, it seems suspicious. But I think
it would have ended well though, but they made it look
well, I mean,
like it didn't.
they probably would have spun it though. If he didn't do it, they would have spun it and be like, well, why wouldn't you just do it? If you're innocent, like what do you have to hide?
Yeah.
Like it's okay for them to hide stuff and not record hours of sessions, but like if he refuses to do a polygraph test, then oh my god, he must be guilty. So.
I never understood why they make people do polygraphs if it's not admissible in court ever, and they're never ever accurate.
Well, I think they use it as a manipulation tactic. Like they use it to scare you, and then they can use like the results. Like if you're nervous and then you fail it, they know it's not like accurate, but if you fail it, they can use that to be like, well.
But if you pass it, you could be like a really good liar.
Yeah,
too, do you know
exactly.
What I mean?
So it doesn't matter. It's like, oh, you passed, but you're just lying, or you failed because you did it. Like, you know what I mean? So it doesn't matter.
Yeah, I feel like they just use, and obviously, like for him, that he's 16, they can use it for any way that they want.
Yeah, and Jeff passed.
And they don't even have to. They can lie about the results of it too.
Did Jeff pass his?
Well, they say the police say that he failed, but I don't trust a damn thing that the police say. So maybe we'll ask Jeff, but I mean, maybe he doesn't even know that.
And it's really easy to manipulate too if you don't record everything, because I know even in that episode that I talked about, that investigation discovery, they like were talking to Jeff and they're like, pretend it was you, what would you have done, and like tell us from your point of view. And so when he was talking like first person. He was like, I walked down the path, like I saw her. And so they took this as like, look, he's telling the story, when it actually, that's what they told him to do. So I mean, if they could just like cut that out of them telling him to say that and be like, look what he just told us. So I mean,
and then record when he's saying that, I did this, I did this, and they're like, oh, see what happened? It's like, yeah, but there's 3 hours before that you didn't record.
yeah, we fed him the story and then told him to retell it. So
it's like they only recorded 35 minutes because there was only 35 minutes of things that we could actually spin to make it sound like he's guilty. So we'll just use that 35 minutes. The rest of it is not important.
Ridiculous.
It actually frightens me of how like shoddy a lot of police work is. In a lot of cases that we've done, we've seen a lot of shoddy police work, and it's actually kind of bizarre how much there is out there that they don't show, they don't do, or like just the shoddiness of their work. Like I feel like it's so
scary,
common that it's actually ridiculous.
It's crazy. It can happen to you, basically. Is the message I'm getting from this. So the police asked Jeff to take a polygraph test on January 25th. So from 9:30 a.m. to 5 p.m. that day, Deskovic was questioned and polygraphed and was eventually informed by the police that he had failed the test. But like, as we kind of touched on, I don't know if that's even true, if he did fail the test or whatever, because I can't trust anything the police say or do. But at this time, after hours of telling Jeff that they know that he committed the murder due to his failed polygraph, Jeff eventually, with air quotes, confessed to the rape and murder of Angela. And then afterwards, it's reported that he went into the fetal position under the table in the interrogation room after this quote-unquote confession. So one major reason that the prosecution gave in their arguments during all of this for why Jeff was guilty surrounded a detailed sketch that Jeff had provided to police outlining the locations of 3 distinct crime scenes. Now, remember before I mentioned that there were kind of 3 areas of, I guess, the park that were considered crime scenes, so there were 3 different ones, and this was information that they claimed that Jeff would not have known unless he was involved in the murder. However, this report on Jeffrey's case that I said, like, by the Westchester County DA, claims that information about the specifics of the crime, such as the crime scenes, may have been told to Jeff by the police themselves. So, of course, we don't know what was said in those moments that were not recorded on tape for those various interrogations. So like I said, they could have been planting seeds or giving little bits of information about those specifics, not like in full detail, but just enough information, and then he might go off on those and like talk about them, and then they use it, to say that he knew this stuff. And there's no record on the recording of them telling him this stuff, of course, but they didn't record that. So also another thing that they mentioned in this report that's possible is like maybe the information did get around the community despite the police's best efforts to keep it secret. So like Peekskill was a small-ish town. I Googled it, and like the population now is like 23,000 people. I don't know what it was back in 1990, but small enough, like maybe rumors about the circumstances of the murder can run rampant. So, you can't really control those kind of rumors and stuff when something happens in a small town. The defense never argued these points in the original trial, like about how like the rumor mill might have taken place in the town, or like that the police themselves might have been feeding him this information. So they didn't argue that in the trial, which is one example of how Jeff's attorney completely dropped the ball throughout the whole process. He didn't have a good defense attorney at all. But there are those possible reasons why this information may have been out there. Like, it is explainable. But looking at all the other blatant misconduct in this case, it isn't out of the realm of possibility that the police leaked this information to Jeff themselves and then used it against him when he mentioned this information later. So there's no actual supporting evidence to back up this claim, but it could easily explain how the information that the police say was only to be known by the perpetrator made its way to Jeff. So those are just like 2 possible reasons as to how that could have happened. And I just wanted to say, just think about it. Like, you all know how in small towns, like, we grew up in a small town, and like when we had that case that happened in our town back in 2011, like with Amber Kerwin, how like people talk about rumors and like people are speculating about what it might have happened, or like people who might have been involved, and I eventually you don't even know what's true, what's not. Like, half the information's out there that's not even accurate, but people just take it as fact. So like, you just think of a small town, like high school students, like it's probably running around the school, like all these rumors about like how she was killed or where she was killed and all that kind of stuff. I don't see it as like out of the realm of possibility that these are just stuff that was out there in the community, that just because Jeff did end up knowing a little bit about it, and he was kind of helping them with his police work, right? Like, he could have talked to people at school who might have heard that and it got to his mind, or more likely maybe the police just said it to him themselves. So like, there are reasons there. Like, it's not crazy to think that he knew this information.
Yeah, it's crazy how like in small towns how things get so blown out of proportion. It's kind of like that. I don't know if you ever played that secret game where you tell somebody a secret and then they go around the room and you whatever. It's kind of like that. Like you get to the end and it's like totally different than what that first person said. So it's kind of like that. Like, somebody says something, then somebody blows it out of proportion, then somebody else says something. So it's kind of crazy. Not that it's probably not irrelevant, but the population back in 1990 in Peekskill was 19,000.
Okay.
Not that it matters, but
so smaller than 23,000, but
yeah,
I mean, still small enough. Like, our town obviously was like 4,000 or less or whatever, but like 19,000 is still small enough. Like, it's, I feel like the rumor mill is still a thing. Even in cities it's a thing, but I just feel like it's like the gossip of the town. Like, people want to talk about stuff that happened. I don't know.
And maybe because like Jeffrey came from like a low income family and like he didn't really fit in with like this class, like his class or whatever. He didn't really have a lot of friends, so maybe a lot of people were thinking like he could have done it, like he was just like a loner. I don't know. So there's rumors about him probably going around too about like why he would have done it.
Yeah. Like, it's not crazy to think that obviously this information was out there, so it's not like privileged information. Like, you know, in other cases when they keep information close to the vest, like to prevent, you know, this sort of thing from happening. But obviously that wasn't done in this case, and it doesn't really matter exactly what the reasoning was, but all we know is that Jeff had this information that I mean, he shouldn't have known.
The police took him out to the crime scene to like reenact things, so I feel like it's super like not unbelievable that he would know some of these things, whether they meant to tell him or not. Like, you know, he was in it with them.
It's kind of like going back to Adnan's case where they take Jay out to where he was, or like I forget what it was, but they like kind of were telling him what to say in the story of the day that the girl was killed. Kind of like the same thing, like you're grooming him, telling him what to say in Jay's situation.
Jay's story changed so many times because it didn't fit, so the cops are like, oh, actually this didn't happen, so what actually did? Like, so I mean, yeah, it's super, doesn't surprise me.
Yeah, it's just crazy. But like, the prosecution tried to argue that confidentiality in the investigation was thoroughly maintained throughout the entire process, so therefore if Jeff knew this information, then it was because of his own guilt. But obviously, if Jeff knew this information despite not being involved in the crime at all in any fashion, obviously it wasn't the case. That's not the case that their confidentiality was maintained. So it was just lies from the police and the prosecution in this case. Also, Jeff's knowledge of the note to Freddie Claxton, which was found underneath Angela's body, was also a reason why police claimed that he had to be the killer. Again, because they say that no one else would know that. That wasn't public knowledge, but again, there's no evidence to suggest how this information became known to Jeff, but he did know about the letter. And in that report also, I believe it says that the police questioned Freddie about the letter when they were interrogating him initially. So like I said, it's high school students. They ask him that's going to be in his mind, and then he's going to tell his friends, who are going to then tell other people, and like soon everyone knows about it. So I feel like people forget, like, it's common knowledge, but it's not public knowledge. You know what I mean? Like, everyone knows about it, even though it hasn't been like necessarily reported on or whatever.
Yeah, I feel like these people, those kids that were talk to police in the school, they're going to talk to each other. Like, that stuff's going to get out, even if the police tell them not to talk about it. Like, they're high school kids. They're going to want to talk about it. So it's so easy for that kind of stuff to get out and around.
And not even them, like their parents of the students are going to talk about it too. Like, if they like, just because
everyone's going to talk about it. Like,
just because it's not reported in the media doesn't mean everyone in the whole town doesn't know about it. Like that, yeah.
And back then, like, media wasn't as prevalent as it is now. So like a lot of it probably was like word of mouth, where now it would be like you're texting somebody or you're like putting it on Facebook or whatever.
Yeah, and like now it would be easier to be like, okay, yeah, somebody did put it on Facebook, or there's a Facebook chat about it. Like, that stuff they can prove, but when people are just talking, there's no way to prove that. So I think that it hurt Jeff that there was no like social media kind of thing. Maybe. Yeah,
that's true. That's true too. That's a good point. Never thought of that, really. So yeah, it's just kind of crazy how all of that kind of information got twisted and it got turned back around on Jeff. So jump to a year later, in January of 1991, Jeff was tried and a jury convicted him of Angela's murder at the age of 17. So at the time of the sentencing, Jeff was quoted as saying, "I didn't do anything. I've already had a year of my life taken from me for something I didn't do, and I'm about to lose more time, and I didn't do anything." So unfortunately, Jeff spent the next 15 years incarcerated for this crime that he didn't commit due to the false confession that he gave. But this confession was also given under immense pressure and suspicious circumstances. So for one, Jeff was driven out of his hometown to another police station in another city. And in an interview that I watched with Jeff, he mentions that this was probably, so that he wouldn't be in familiar territory, and he felt like he couldn't really easily escape or walk away. So like if he got uncomfortable during the questioning or whatever, it's not like he could just get up, leave the police station and walk home. He was in a completely different town. He didn't have a driver's license. Like, he's stuck in this town. So he felt like he couldn't go anywhere. He was kind of trapped in that place. He was also given no food at all during that whole day, and he was given lots of coffee. Jeff says he wasn't a coffee drinker, so this made him very jittery and nervous from the get-go. So all these factors in play, plus the failed polygraph, were then used against Jeff in a situation that was so intense and overwhelming that Jeff was tricked into confessing to a crime they had no part in and had no information about who had done it either. So he was completely innocent, but police misconduct, manipulation, and their strong desire to pin this murder on him, was with almost nothing concrete linking him to it, is pretty baffling. So pretty crazy that he even got convicted. But like I said, in the trial, the main things that were used against him were obviously this confession, but a lot of information about like how that confession was given was like withheld from the trial. So the jury, I don't think, knew the full circumstances of that. Also the fact that he knew all this information, that the police say that they maintained confidentiality the whole time throughout. So all of that stuff was kind of used. And then they also used his demeanor and like how devastated he was about the murder. They tried to spin that as being a sign of remorse and guilt. So the jury just kind of saw that, took all those factors in, and then just convicted him. So it's pretty crazy. So he was only 17 when he got sentenced to 15 years to life. And so flash forward to 2006. So he's been in prison for 15 years. The Innocence Project takes on Jeff's case, and we're actually able to enter the DNA from the case into the New York State DNA database. So this was actually some newer technology that wasn't available at the time of the original murder. So they were able to use that new technology and put this DNA into that database, and they actually found a match. And the DNA matched even Cunningham, who was already in prison for the rape and murder of a woman named Patricia Morrison in 1993. Patricia was the sister of his then girlfriend. So Cunningham eventually confessed to the murder of Angela Correa and explained that he strangled her during sex. He was under the influence of cocaine at the time, according to his confession. And he notes that Angela did absolutely nothing to provoke him at all. It kind of just seemed to be a situation of the wrong place at the wrong time, unfortunately. He also says that he doesn't even remember her struggling or telling him to stop. He says that he likely blocked it out. So due to the DNA match and confession from Cunningham, Deskovic was officially exonerated and released from prison on September 20th, 2006. So it's crazy. Jeff went into prison when he was 17. Then he spent the next 15 years incarcerated. And then it's been 15 years since he was released from prison. And he's spent the last 15 years of his life working hard as an advocate for wrongfully convicted people, even going to law school and eventually graduating with a law degree in 2019. And he was able to take his personal experiences and story and use that to motivate him in order to advocate for real criminal justice system reform. So after he got released, he also took some lawsuits that he took against the police of Peekskill, and he did win some lawsuits and he got some settlements. So he took some money from those settlements and was able to start the Jeffrey Deskovic Foundation. It's an organization that helps to overturn wrongful convictions, also provides support once these people are released from prison. So things like social programs, employment, housing, and the foundation also advocates for the reform of the criminal justice system in order to get accountability from the system and the people within it for their role in these wrongful convictions. Jeff has helped to exonerate 7 people who were wrongfully convicted since he started the foundation, and even had a role in abolishing the death penalty in Connecticut since. So he's been very active and doing lots of great work. Unfortunate that he had to go through 15 years of hell basically in order to do that, but he at least is helping other people now. You know, he's giving back to the community, and it's a system that screwed him over. He's trying to prevent it from screwing other people over. But as we know, there's so many people who are still wrongfully convicted, even to this day. So yeah, it's a pretty crazy case, and it's just baffling to me that he was even able to be convicted based on that lack of evidence. But we see that in other cases all the time. So yeah, do you guys have any thoughts or opinions? Or
I was just like, I wanted to go back to like the beginning of when he was looked at as a suspect. Like, I find it so crazy how police get just like tunnel vision of this like one person that they're focusing on. There could be like 1,000 other witnesses, but they're focusing on this one person. Like, we saw it like in Adnan, we see it in, like, if you guys ever watched the Stephen Avery thing, like, we see it all the time, and it just frustrates me to no end that they'd have like this one person because of like, I don't know, like just the way he acted during the like in the interview, or just the way his demeanor was. Like, they just focus and have this tunnel vision of this one person, and they don't care about anybody else who may have been affected or been involved. Like,
I feel like, I don't know, when you look at like people who are like body language experts or like people's demeanors, like I feel like that alone should not be used as any sort of like indication. Like, obviously I'm not an expert in that, but like I feel like everyone just reacts to things differently. Like people react to trauma or grief or loss differently. So just looking at it like, oh, he was acting strangely. Like when you have, like it can be used to be like, to kind of back up other arguments that be like, why did this happen or why did this happen? But on its own, I don't think should stand as like.
Because I find like if you cry too much, then you're showing remorse. Or if you cry too much, then you're showing grief. Like, there's no, like, middle ground. It's just like, oh, if you're crying too much, it could be a good thing. If you're crying too much, it could be a bad thing. Or if you're not crying at all.
Spin it, like, whatever way suits them, basically.
Yeah. So basically, it's like the police, it doesn't really matter what you do. The police are going to spin whatever you do to fit whatever narrative they're trying to push. So it's so frustrating. And, yeah, it's a crazy case. Like I said, there's so many other details in that report. So we'll probably put that a link to that report in the show notes so you can like read it in full. It's really, really interesting read. It's like 40 pages. But it's like fascinating to read because there's so many other things that were wrong with like the defense attorneys, the prosecution, all this stuff. When you're listening, like, if you want to know more about the case, and obviously we're going to be interviewing Jeff. So we're going to get probably a lot more information there as well. But I just kind of touched the surface on some of the police misconduct because there's so much more.
When I was looking at this case for this episode, when I came across that report, and I normally don't read something that's like that long, but like as soon as I started reading it, I just like got so interested in the whole, like I read the whole thing, and I'm just like, wow, this is like crazy, this case. So it's a really good read if you're into that type of stuff, reading a report.
And it's not really like, but it's not really, I don't know, it wasn't really written like a normal report that you would think like super boring. Like it was written in like layman's terms. Like anyone can kind of really understand what it was saying. It was easy to understand, easy to read, but just very interesting.
And they do talk about like police and prosecution, like misconduct in television in that report too, of like,
it basically gives you a whole entire rundown of every reason why the police investigation was a sham. So definitely worth reading.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to talking to Jeff because there's only so much we can understand by like research and, you know, looking things up, and there's things that you can't get unless you're actually talking to the person that went through it. So it's going to be super interesting just to like hear like from firsthand from Jeff.
Yeah, that's what I'm waiting. Like I'm really interested to see like his thoughts of the whole thing, like even starting off when he was being questioned, like what was going through his mind at the time. Because like Kay said, we can read about it, we can like watch documentaries about it, but talking to the actual person that was actually there at the time is a whole different perspective, and it's going to be interesting to see what he has to say.
Yeah, for sure. Like it just adds a whole another level, right? Like you can research, you feel like you can understand the case from like top to bottom, you know everything about it, but like actually hearing from it firsthand, like you're not going to get those like that perspective of like what it was like in prison for 15 years. Like you're not going to get that really from reading the report on a piece of paper. So
yeah, and like we could even like talk to him about like what happened when those tapes were turned off. Like nobody can know that except obviously him and the police. And you know, he'd be the one. The
police aren't going to be honest.
That's what I mean. He'd be the one that's going to be like, this is how it went down. So it's going to be super interesting.
And like, in case anyone is like, has any doubts or questions out there, like he is totally 100% innocent. Like the DNA exonerated him. Like he is in no way involved in this. So, you know, hearing his perspective and what happened in those meetings, like it's going to be totally like legitimate. Like obviously, you know, he has nothing to hide. He didn't do it. So.
And the fact that he sued the police, the fact that he won, just shows like how shoddy the work of the police was, though.
Yeah, like this report that we're referencing was actually written in 2007, so it was written like a year after he was released. So that was probably during like all of those like civil cases and all of that kind of stuff is when this report came out. Yeah, it's a crazy case, and like I said, we did just touch the surface of this case. We went into a little bit of the police misconduct, but there's so much more. So you can definitely check out that report by the Westchester County DA's office. It's a really interesting read if you want to know more information. And also definitely stay tuned for part 2, because we're going to be interviewing Jeff himself, and he's going to have such a unique perspective, such an interesting conversation, and we're very, very excited to have him with us for part 2. So thank you so much for listening to part 1. As always, you can find us on Instagram at Crime Family Podcast, also on Twitter at Crime Family Pod 1. We do have a Facebook page, Crime Family Podcast, and you can email us as well at crimefamilypodcast@gmail.com. Send us some case suggestions, some feedback. Tell all your friends about the podcast. Leave us a review if you would like on Apple Podcasts, and get the word out there, because all your support and word of mouth is really supportive as well. So thank you so much for listening. And yeah, we're releasing part 2 and part 3 today as well. So you can go keep on listening, and we'll see you in part 2. Take care.